In 1997, the entire European nation of Albania just fell apart. The government was overthrown, state authority dissolved, and the country spiraled into total anarchy. But what sparked this collapse wasn't an invasion or a typical political coup. It was something much, much stranger. It all started with a promise of unimaginable wealth, whispered across a nation desperate for a better future, a promise that would seduce 2/3 of the population into betting their life savings, their homes, and their futures on a fantasy. This is the story of how a handful of get-rich-quick schemes drove a country to the very edge of self-destruction, and then pushed it over, starting a civil war where more than 1,000,000 guns flooded the streets and armed gangs ruled. So, how could this even happen? To get it, you have to understand what Albania was like in the early 1990s. For nearly 50 years, it had been one of the world's most isolated and repressive communist dictatorships. Under the iron fist of Enver Hoxha, it was Europe's poorest country, almost completely cut off from the outside world. When the regime finally crumbled in 1991, Albanians blinked in the sunlight of a new capitalist world they barely understood. The transition was jarring. For regular people, the formal banking system was practically useless, slow, clunky, and deeply distrusted. Many just kept their life savings as cash under the mattress. Into this financial vacuum stepped a new kind of entrepreneur. They set up companies with impressive names like Vifa, Kamberi, and Gialika, and they made an incredible offer. Deposit your money, and you would get astronomical interest rates. At first, it seemed like a miracle. We're not talking about 5% interest a year. In the final, frenzied months of 1996, some schemes were offering 30% or even 40% interest per month. One company, Sud, offered to double your money in 2 months. Another, Shafari, promised to triple it in 3. And for a while it worked. Early investors got their payouts, and their success stories spread like wildfire. As societal fever took hold, it felt real. People who had lived their entire lives in poverty were suddenly buying apartments and cars. One resident later recalled that in the fall of 1996, the capital city of Tirana smelled like a slaughterhouse, as farmers drove their livestock to market to sell them and invest the proceeds. Families sold their homes. As one investor, Majana Muka, later said, "I sold my private villa, and all of this money I invested. My husband and I hoped that we could buy a second home for our children. This is the biggest mistake my family made." But what really sealed the deal for most people? The government seemed to be okay with it. President Salih Berisha's administration did little to stop the schemes. In fact, many of the companies had close ties to his ruling Democratic Party, making political contributions and fueling a sense of legitimacy. When international bodies like the IMF warned that this was a house of cards, the government defended the companies, accusing outsiders of being jealous and trying to sabotage Albania's most successful firms. The public, caught in the euphoria, agreed. To them, this wasn't a scam. It was their path to prosperity. But it was a scam, the most elaborate and widespread Ponzi scheme in modern history. These companies weren't making real profits. They were just using the money from new investors to pay the impossibly high returns to earlier ones. It's a game of musical chairs, and eventually, the music has to stop. The first crack in the dam appeared in November 1996. Sud, one of the most aggressive firms, defaulted on its payments. Suddenly, the river of new money keeping the whole system afloat began to dry up. Confidence, the only real currency these schemes had, evaporated overnight. The moment of truth for many came from a woman named Maksuda Kadina, the founder of the Sud scheme, a former shoe factory worker. She stood on the balcony of her apartment building, facing a crowd of hundreds of anxious investors. Through a megaphone, she delivered the final blow. "My game is over." It was a pyramid game. "My company is bankrupt, and you shouldn't ask for the money." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Then chaos. In January 1997, Sud and another major firm, Gallica, officially declared bankruptcy. The dominoes fell in rapid succession. The scheme's liabilities had reached nearly 1.2 billion, almost half of the country's entire GDP. 2/3 of the population, an estimated 1.8 million people, lost everything. Life savings, inheritances, money from relatives abroad, all gone. People who had sold their homes to invest were now facing homelessness. The shock quickly morphed into rage. The protests began peacefully. In cities across the country, tens of thousands took to the streets, demanding their money back and demanding accountability. They blamed the government of President Salih Berisha, who they believed had either profited from the schemes or let them flourish through negligence. The government's response, it was a disaster. Instead of dialogue, they met peaceful protests with force. A government minister sent to the city of Lushange to calm the crowds was kidnapped by furious demonstrators. On March 2nd, the government declared a state of emergency, authorizing police to shoot armed rioters on sight. But this only threw gasoline on the fire. The public's trust was shattered. They felt betrayed not just by the con artists, but by their own leaders. The economic crisis was about to become a political one. The point of no return came with a simple, terrifying idea. The logic went something like this. If the state failed us, and even betrayed us, then its power means nothing. And the symbols of that power, they were ripe for the taking. Mobs began storming military armories and police stations. What they found inside was shocking. Many weapons depots were abandoned, with soldiers either deserting or joining the rebellion. In just a few weeks, an estimated 1 million weapons were looted from state stockpiles. Machine guns, Kalashnikovs, pistols, and grenades flooded the streets, falling into the hands of ordinary, desperate citizens and organized criminal gangs. By March 1997, Albania had basically stopped functioning as a country. The government lost all control, especially in the south, which fell to rebels and mafia bosses who gave themselves the grand title. Committees of Public Salvation, police and army units deserted en masse. Government buildings were burned to the ground. Customs and tax offices were destroyed, causing government revenues to completely collapse. Life became a daily struggle for survival. With no police, armed gangs ruled the cities, setting up checkpoints and fighting turf wars. One man, searching for his kidnapped brother in the city of Vlore, described it as an armed mafia fiefdom where there were no police, no institutions to help us. The violence was indiscriminate. Over the next few months, around 2,000 people were killed. The country wasn't on the brink of anarchy. It was anarchy. Foreign nations scrambled to evacuate their citizens in dramatic helicopter missions. The story of Albania's collapse is a chilling reminder of how fragile a society can be when trust is completely shattered. If you think stories like this are as fascinating as we do, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Facing total collapse, President Berisha was forced to resign. An international peacekeeping force of 7,000 troops, led by Italy, entered the country in April to restore order and secure humanitarian aid. New elections were held and a new government was formed. Slowly, painfully, Albania started the long process of rebuilding from the ashes of its own financial fantasy. The economic damage was severe. In 1997 alone, output fell by 7%, and inflation shot up to over 40%. But the deepest scars weren't economic. The crisis destroyed the Albanian people's faith in their new democracy and the very idea of a market economy. It showed how desperation, greed, and corrupt governance could unleash a catastrophe. So what about today? Albania has, for the most part, recovered. It is a member of NATO and a candidate for the European Union. In the center of Tirana, a brutalist pyramid once designed as a mausoleum for the communist dictator is now a coding academy. For a younger generation, the events of 1997 can sound like a tall tale, but for those who lived through it, it's a haunting memory of when a dream of getting rich quick didn't just cost them their savings, it cost them their country. A dark lesson in the devastating price of a promise that was always too good to be true.